The funding cuts were supposed to be temporary. That's how these things are always described in Washington. A pause, a restructuring period, a budget realignment. Meanwhile, 4 major American physics labs either lost projects, lost expansion plans, or quietly bled researchers over the last few years while Congress argued about deficits and strategic priorities. At almost the exact same time, China opened or expanded 22 advanced physics facilities across fields ranging from fusion research to quantum materials to high-energy lasers. 22. And before somebody says, well, China just throws money at everything, pause for a second. Because the important part isn't the number of buildings, it's the timeline. Most of those Chinese facilities were approved, funded, and built during the same period the United States was still debating whether basic science deserved predictable financing at all. That difference matters more than people realize. Because physics labs are not apps. You cannot build world-class experimental science quarter to quarter like a Silicon Valley earnings report. Particle accelerators, fusion facilities, superconducting materials research, quantum sensing programs. These things operate on timelines so long that politicians almost physically dislike them. 10 years, 15 sometimes, no immediate payoff, no ribbon-cutting headline that survives the next election cycle. But here's the uncomfortable part for the United States. Almost every technology Americans currently depend on came out of exactly that kind of slow, patient research environment. GPS MRI machines, semiconductor lithography, fiber optics. Even parts of modern AI hardware trace back to publicly funded physics programs that looked financially ridiculous at the time. Bell Labs understood this once. Los Alamos did too. So did Brookhaven, Fermilab, Lawrence Berkeley. The old American model assumed that if you gave very smart people stable funding long enough, eventually they would discover things industry didn't even know it needed yet. China watched that system carefully, then copied the parts America stopped believing in. There's a document from China's Ministry of Science and Technology published after the 14th five-year plan rollout that almost nobody outside policy circles read. Buried inside it is a phrase that explains nearly everything happening right now. Long-cycle strategic research capacity. Not quarterly innovation, not startup disruption. Long-cycle capacity. In other words, build institutions that can survive political mood swings long enough to compound knowledge over decades. That sounds boring, which is probably why most people ignored it. But physics is one of those fields where boring countries eventually become dangerous countries, especially when the science connects directly to semiconductors, hypersonics, quantum communications, energy systems, or next-generation manufacturing. The line between basic research and strategic advantage gets blurry very fast. And this is where the story stops being academic. The United States still leads in top-tier research quality overall. That's true. American universities remain extraordinary. The country still attracts elite global talent. Anyone pretending America has already lost is oversimplifying the picture. But something deeper has shifted underneath the numbers. In 2001, according to NSF and OECD research comparisons, the U.S. overwhelmingly dominated global high-impact physics output. China was still viewed as a manufacturing platform with uneven research quality. 2 decades later, China produces more physics papers annually than the United States in several advanced subfields, while also building new national laboratories at a speed Western democracies increasingly struggle to match. And honestly, the strangest part is how quiet this transition has been. No dramatic collapse, no Sputnik moment, no single headline people can point to. Just a slow migration of scientific gravity. One researcher leaves because grant renewals became uncertain. One project gets delayed 3 years because appropriations stalled. One graduate student decides the better-funded lab is in Hefei instead of Chicago. Then another. Then another. Institutions decay the same way coastlines do. Gradually. Then all at once. There's also a contradiction sitting underneath this entire story that almost nobody in Washington wants to confront directly. The U.S. political system keeps saying China is the defining technological challenge of the century, while simultaneously treating long-term scientific funding like optional spending. That is a very strange way to compete with a civilization that plans in decades. And the irony here is almost painful. America still possesses the scientific ecosystem China spent years trying to imitate. The infrastructure exists. The talent exists. The universities exist. The question is whether the country still has the patience required to maintain it. Because in physics, falling behind rarely feels dramatic at first. You usually notice 10 years later, when the patents, factories, supply chains, and talent pipelines have already moved somewhere else. One of the labs that worried American officials most over the last few years wasn't military. It was a fusion center. The experimental advanced superconducting tokamak in Hefei, East, became famous online because people started calling it China's artificial sun, which sounds like the kind of phrase usually invented by science journalists after 3 coffees and a deadline. But underneath the dramatic nickname was something very real. China steadily extending plasma confinement times in fusion experiments, while Western programs kept running into funding uncertainty and coordination problems. Again, this isn't about one breakthrough. Fusion has been 30 years away for roughly half a century now. The point is persistence. Who keeps showing up every year with upgraded facilities, larger engineering teams, and stable state backing? That matters. Because advanced physics isn't linear. Most experiments fail. Entire decades sometimes produce almost nothing commercially useful. Countries that dominate these fields are usually the ones capable of absorbing long stretches of apparent failure without panicking. The United States used to be exceptionally good at that. Then finance culture started leaking into science policy. You can actually track the mentality shift historically. After the Cold War ended, Washington gradually moved away from the old national laboratory mindset toward a more market-oriented assumption. If research becomes important enough, private industry will eventually fund it. And to be fair, in software and consumer technology, that model worked astonishingly well. Silicon Valley generated enormous wealth, but fundamental physics is different. A venture capitalist cannot wait 18 years for uncertain plasma research while limited partners ask for quarterly returns. That's not a criticism. It's just structural reality. Which is why China's system, despite all its inefficiencies and political problems, ended up unusually suited for this particular moment. The Chinese Academy of Sciences doesn't need every project to justify itself immediately. Neither do state-backed provincial governments trying to attract prestige laboratories into regional industrial clusters. Hefei became a perfect example of this strategy. 20 years ago, it was not considered one of China's premier innovation centers. Today, it hosts quantum research institutes, supercomputing facilities, fusion programs, and advanced materials labs tied directly into manufacturing ecosystems. That last part is critical. China isn't building physics labs as isolated prestige projects. They're increasingly connected to industrial policy. Research feeds factories. Factories feed scaling capacity. Scaling capacity feeds export dominance. Then profits cycle back into research again. It's a loop. The US system often separates those pieces into different worlds entirely. Universities over here, manufacturing somewhere overseas, venture capital in another ecosystem. Federal science agencies trapped inside annual budget battles. Coordination becomes difficult even when the talent is world-class. And there's a human dimension buried inside this that statistics miss. A few years ago, several researchers interviewed by Nature and Science magazine described younger physicists increasingly making career calculations based not only on salary or prestige, but on whether projects would actually survive long enough to matter. Imagine spending 8 years specializing in a field only to watch funding disappear halfway through the experiment. People remember that, especially international researchers who can work almost anywhere. One American physicist described modern grant applications as performative certainty. That phrase stayed with me because it captures something broken in the culture itself. Scientists increasingly feel pressure to promise immediate applications, measurable outcomes, and commercial relevance before the science even exists. Physics does not work like that. The transistor came from curiosity-driven quantum research. Lasers were once mocked as a solution looking for a problem. Early particle physics looked financially absurd to critics until it quietly helped create technologies underlying modern computing and medical imaging. Civilizations often look irrational right before they become powerful. China seems to understand this better than many Western policymakers expected. That doesn't mean every Chinese lab succeeds. Far from it. Some facilities are inefficient. Some projects waste money. Certain headline claims from Chinese institutions absolutely deserve skepticism. And yes, there are still major concerns around transparency, intellectual property, and political control inside the Chinese system. Those criticisms are real. But here's the problem for Washington. Even inefficient, large-scale scientific expansion still creates capability over time. A nation does not need every lab to succeed if enough of them survive long enough to produce breakthroughs accidentally. Meanwhile, several American national laboratories have spent years dealing with delayed upgrades, hiring bottlenecks, aging infrastructure, and increasingly unstable federal planning cycles. Not collapse. Drift. There's a difference. And this is where that number from the opening, 22 new Chinese facilities against 4 struggling American labs, starts landing differently. The issue isn't simply who spends more money. It's which country currently behaves like the future is worth preparing for decades in advance. But there's a catch here that complicates the entire story. Scientific power is not the same thing as scientific freedom. And this is where the American advantage remains very real, even if people inside the US increasingly take it for granted. A physics lab is more than machinery. It's culture. It's whether researchers can fail publicly without fear, whether younger scientists can challenge senior figures, whether bad results get buried or debated, whether international collaboration feels natural or politically dangerous. That matters more than spreadsheets sometimes. The Soviet Union had brilliant physicists, absolutely extraordinary ones. Yet parts of its scientific system eventually hardened under bureaucracy and political pressure. Innovation slowed not because talent disappeared, but because institutional fear entered the bloodstream. China is aware of this risk. You can actually see Beijing trying to balance control with openness at the same time, which is a very difficult thing to do. The government wants world-class discovery, but it also wants ideological discipline and strategic alignment. Those goals occasionally collide. Quantum computing is a good example. China has invested heavily through institutions like the University of Science and Technology of China and state-backed quantum programs in Hefei. In 2020, researchers there claimed quantum supremacy on a photonic machine called Zhuzhang. Western scientists debated the framing, but nobody dismissed the underlying achievement. It was serious work. Still, many top Chinese researchers continue seeking collaboration with American and European institutions because frontier science thrives on openness. Ideas move faster in ecosystems where information flows freely. And here's the reversal that changes the story a little. The United States may actually be underinvesting in the one thing that still gives it an edge: scientific culture itself. Not just labs, not budgets alone, the atmosphere around discovery. Because America's greatest historical advantage was never simply government spending. The Soviet Union spent enormous amounts too. The real strength came from the strange combination the US accidentally built after World War II. Elite universities, immigrant talent, relatively open debate, deep private capital markets, and federal research funding all feeding each other at once. That ecosystem is hard to copy. China can construct buildings faster. It can scale manufacturing faster. In some areas, it can probably deploy applied technologies faster. But recreating the intellectual atmosphere that produced places like Bell Labs or MIT in their golden eras is harder than pouring concrete. The danger for America is not immediate defeat. It's self-inflicted erosion. Visa restrictions tighten. Young researchers face unstable academic careers. Basic science becomes politically vulnerable every budget cycle. Universities increasingly depend on short-term corporate incentives. Meanwhile, top students look at physics PhDs and quietly conclude they'd rather work in finance or software because the pay difference borders on comedy. A civilization making trillion-dollar decisions about AI chips and quantum systems probably should not treat physicists like economically confused hobbyists. Just a thought. And the economic consequences here are enormous, even for people who will never step inside a laboratory. Advanced physics sits upstream from entire industries. Semiconductor materials research determines computing power. Energy physics shapes electricity costs. Quantum sensing affects navigation, logistics, and defense systems. Superconductors could eventually rewrite industrial efficiency if major breakthroughs happen. Whoever dominates those layers often controls the profitable industries built on top later. That's partly why the CHIPS and Science Act passed in 2022 with bipartisan support. Washington finally recognized that outsourcing manufacturing while neglecting long-horizon research had created vulnerabilities. The law authorized roughly $280 billion across semiconductor incentives and scientific research initiatives. But authorization is not the same as execution. Some funding still moves slowly. Certain research agencies remain trapped inside political fights. Projects announced with fanfare often encounter delays once they meet the actual machinery of American governance. China noticed that too. One thing I'm still not completely certain about is whether U.S. policymakers truly understand the psychological effect of consistency. Researchers don't just follow money, they follow confidence. They go where they believe projects will survive long enough to become meaningful. That's why this competition may ultimately hinge less on intelligence and more on endurance. Can democratic systems maintain scientific focus across multiple administrations, economic cycles, and political mood swings? Or does every long-term project eventually become vulnerable to short-term pressure? Because physics rewards countries willing to think beyond election calendars. And historically, civilizations that stop investing in foundational science usually discover the consequences indirectly at first, through weaker industries, dependency on foreign supply chains, and technologies invented somewhere else. By the time it becomes obvious, the adjustment period is already painful. There's a tendency in American politics to treat science leadership like a natural resource, as if the country simply produces it automatically. History says otherwise. Britain led the industrial world for over a century until manufacturing gravity shifted elsewhere. The Soviet Union dominated parts of space science before stagnation hollowed the system out. Scientific leadership is not inherited permanently. It has to be renewed continuously, often through investments that look wasteful right before they become essential. That's the real story behind those 4 struggling American labs and China's 22 new ones. Not panic, not propaganda, something quieter. One country increasingly treats physics as national infrastructure. The other keeps debating whether long-term research is a luxury item. And to be fair, America still has enormous strengths. The best universities on Earth are still disproportionately American. The global scientific community still wants access to U.S. institutions. NVIDIA, SpaceX, national laboratories, advanced chip design, biomedical research. None of this disappears overnight, but dominance erodes asymmetrically. You lose small pieces first. A materials breakthrough happens elsewhere. A battery chemistry patent moves overseas. A quantum researcher stays in Shanghai instead of moving to California. A fusion engineer decides the better-funded project is in Hefei. None of those stories individually feel historic. Together, they become history. My own view is that the United States still has time to reverse this drift, but only if it rediscovers something it used to understand instinctively. Scientific power compounds slowly. You cannot rebuild lost research ecosystems on demand during a geopolitical emergency. By then, the talent pipelines, industrial clusters, and institutional memory are already rooted somewhere else. China understands that patience has strategic value. That may be the single biggest shift of the last 20 years. Not that China suddenly became smarter than America, not that American science collapsed. The shift is that Beijing increasingly behaves like foundational research is worth sustaining through decades of uncertainty, while parts of the U.S. system behave as though every investment must justify itself immediately. Physics does not reward impatience, neither does history. And there's one final irony sitting underneath all this. The technologies that may define the next century, fusion energy, quantum systems, advanced materials, next-generation semiconductors, were all born from fields many politicians once dismissed as too theoretical, too slow, or too expensive. Civilizations usually regret underfunding science about 15 years later. Unfortunately, physics keeps receipts. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe. I'm trying to follow the stories hiding underneath the headlines. The slow changes that only look obvious after they've already happened.